First of all, we're going to finish this second section tonight in the intertestamental period, social background to the period between the Testaments. And we're going to be looking at the top of page 4 on your outline, letter C, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Underneath social backgrounds, we've looked at backgrounds socially, backgrounds economically, and then here we have backgrounds culturally. We look at public conveniences, education, and then languages. Now, public conveniences, maybe they weren't conveniences then. We call them public conveniences, transportation, like what we have today. They weren't so convenient in those days as they are in ours, but that's the way I've entitled it anyway. So you might want to keep that open, and there's how you can number your paper, and you'll have a perfect outline then. We'll be on public conveniences. Let's begin with transportation. We'll look at it by land and by water, and then we'll look at water, then we'll look at libraries, and we get into education, Roman training and Jewish training, and then we get into the languages of the empire. Again, it's to acquaint ourselves with the state of the world, the state of the New Testament, into which the gospel message came, and throughout whose world it went. And so that's to help us better understand things then. Transportation. No jets, so they don't crash over Los Angeles. So you did have some conveniences. Since you didn't have things like that, you didn't have the problems we have with that. But the vast majority of roads, and that's what we have to talk about if we're going to talk about transportation, because they didn't have railroad tracks or runways. The vast majority of roads amounted to little more than dusty trails in Palestine. We'll be looking at this as it has reference to Palestine, as well as its reference that it has to other parts of the Roman Empire, this being part of it. Vast majority of the roads amounted to no more than dusty trails in Palestine. If you'll turn to the back of your Bible, maybe this will be the easiest way to look at it. Let's find a map that we can agree upon. We probably have different Bibles. By the way, by January, may essentially have the same Bible everyone then. That would be helpful. We can always turn to the back. And you won't have to put up with my diagrams anymore then. But if you can find a map, I'm looking at one entitled Palestine in the Time of Christ. And this actually has, you'll have to find one similar. In other words, don't get one back in David's time, because although some of the things would have been the same, a lot of the things have changed. You can find one that has to do with Palestine, where you can see Judea and Samaria, at least Judea and Samaria, somewhere around the 1st century. And I even have my legend up at the top, gives me roads and trade routes on there. And that's, and you see the network. It was a very vast network. Those of you that happen to have a Bible that's like mine or similar to mine, pick out something like Jerusalem. I'll tell you what, if you don't have one like it, I'll put what some of the rest of us are looking at here. If we give ourselves Palestine, give ourselves Jerusalem, give ourselves the Dead Sea. They give us like Jericho over here. You have a road over there to Jericho. You're going to have a road north, south, east, and west. And you've got one that's going to go straight up all the way up through Samaria that goes up through Sycham or Sychar, really the city of Samaria. That's the capital of the country of Samaria. You can either go that way, you see, to get to Caesarea, or they give another one that goes like this over to Joppa. And then you'll have one to the south that goes down toward Hebron, down in this direction. Now these roads, and by the way, these roads, as they existed then, of course, don't exist today, but those are the precise locations where the present roads in Israel are found. I remember driving by bus whenever we left Jerusalem and we were going up here to Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, all through this area of Samaria. And as you get into southern Galilee, it's just beautifully fertile area because of the reclamation of the land that they have made by terracing all the slopes on the hills. But they're hills, like whenever you drive down to where we live right now. You notice how the road doesn't go over tops of any mountains. It weaves its way in and out where those mountains are. As you go down into a valley there, the road will follow that. And look where the Meadowy River goes. It doesn't go over tops of mountains. Water always seeks the lowest place, remember. And so it weaves its way in and out among all these peaks that rise on both sides of it. That's what you're going to have here. This road is really not that straight, but it essentially goes from this point to this point without going this far east or this far west. But it'll weave its way around the mountains, and that was just really the shortest way to travel. And so that could have been a road. It was 2,000 years ago. It probably was essentially the same route 4,000 years ago in the time of Abraham. If you're going to go from central Israel to southern Israel, you'd probably go the same way. My point is today, guess where the road is? In the exact same place, 4,000 years after Abraham's time. Now it's paved. Of course, it's paved today. It's still not that good. It's no expressway or anything like that. It's a little country road is what it is, and the bus, especially if you have a double-decker and you're up on the top, you're leaning back and forth as you handle and maneuver all those curves there, because that's just the way that it is. But most of the roads here in Palestine they're not anything great or grand or glorious. They are nothing really more than just dusty trails. Now, of course, some will be a little larger because they're more well-traveled, and so they can accommodate more people. But the more well-traveled they are, remember, and just think of this, if it's not something calling something else to your remembrance, then the more ruts you're going to have in it from wagons being pulled along there, and the more ruts you're going to have in it from the hooves of the horses and the donkeys and the oxen as they travel along there. And it's going to be rather difficult to continue to go along there. And think about whenever it rains then, and then the road turns into a quagmire of mud. If you look over in Mark chapter 4, in the parable of the sower, he probably doesn't have reference to a major and important road here, but he does have reference to just dusty trails in Palestine. And the road system in Palestine, we could say, was comprised of just large dusty trails, whereas in your local vicinity or neighborhood you have small dusty trails. Mark chapter 4, in verse 4, it came to pass as the sower sowed that some fell by the wayside. And then let's need to get over into the interpretation. Let's start with verse 15. These are they by the wayside, where the word is sown. But when they have heard, Satan cometh immediately and taketh away the word that was sown in their hearts. And he goes on to talk about these were sown on stony ground, and these are sown among thorns and things like that. Well, the wayside, probably what he's talking about is just the beaten paths that are well-traveled in that vicinity, that neighborhood, from maybe one spring to one hunting ground or something, or from the market to the city, or from your back door to your neighbor's front door or something. And therefore the ground is going to be compacted. Therefore when you throw the seed, it'll just exist. It'll just lay up on the top of the ground. And that's why the birds would come and catch it away, because there's nothing that covers it up. And it can't go down in the soil because it's too hard packed there. So that's kind of what Palestine is going to be like. However, when we go out, broaden ourselves, expand ourselves beyond the confines of Palestine and get up into other parts of the Roman Empire, some of the road system changes. Let me diagram some of what the road system looked like in the whole Roman Empire. Or you can find a map again, find one of the whole Roman Empire that will give you, like Paul's travels or something, that will give you the Mediterranean world. I'll just kind of put whatever is significant up here then. Okay, here's Rome. Let's put like Thessalonica way over here. And this region up here is referred to as Illyricum. Okay, there were two very famous roads in the Roman Empire, and by no means do we mean that there were only two important roads, but much of the material of these two roads, and this is what makes them so famous, happen to exist down to today, and sometimes are still used in some portions of the world and travel today, even so far as cars driving on them. And what makes it so different, of course, is the construction of the roads. I'll give you the most famous of these, which is, as you probably already know, the Appian Way. The Appian Way, which ran from Rome down towards the heel of the boot of the country of Italy, down to, well, I don't know, I think it went down to Brundisium. You might have that on your map. I believe that was the end place, and it began up here in Rome. Called the Appian Way. Now, we don't have reference to that in the New Testament by name. We have reference to one of the local stopping points along it. If you'll jump over into Paul's travels in the last chapter of the book of Acts. Paul, by the way, did travel on this road. Acts chapter 28 and verse 15. Acts chapter 28 and verse 15. Into the book of Acts, toward the end of Paul's life and ministry, we have our whole island of Sicily down here, and Malta or Melita, a little island down here, and Paul had landed here, remember, by shipwreck. That was the end of chapter 27, the beginning of chapter 28. And he ends up going around Sicily. Really, it's a lot closer to the toe of the boot of Italy. And then he begins evidently traveling by land up this way. Then he's going to get on the Appian Way. Let's pick up with, we've given you these points before when we studied the book of Acts. Verse 14, when we found brethren and were desired to tarry with them 7 days, and so we went toward Rome. And from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us. That is, the people in Rome, Christians in Rome, came to meet us as far as Appii Forum. And then he says, and the 3 taverns, which was another place there, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. When we come to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was allowed to dwell by himself with the soldier that kept him. Well, that's right up here towards Rome. Again, you might have that on a map in the back. And it gets its name, Appii Forum, from the fact that it existed on the Appian Way. So at least part of this, maybe the upper half, the northern half of the Appian Way, the Apostle Paul's feet would actually have trod upon. And it's there today, as a matter of fact. The same road is there today. Therefore, to walk on that would be to walk in the footsteps of the Apostle Paul. And then the other famous road ran from somewhere on the western shore of Greece over up through Thessalonica and over in this direction. And this was the Ignatian Way. Paul also traveled on this road because it ran up through the city of Thessalonica and through some other cities in that area, and the Apostle Paul would actually have traveled on that as well. Now, what makes the roads significant, I guess, is the fact that they are extant, and what makes them extant, of course, was their process of construction. Their process of construction was nothing, obviously, like what we are cursed with today, where it seems like you always have to be paving and then repaving and then repaving things. You try to make something out of concrete, and it just breaks up, you know. If you try to make a highway out of concrete, it's always breaking up. Try to make something out of asphalt, and it's always tearing up. And you have to repave the asphalt. If it's concrete, you got to dig the concrete up and re-pour some concrete there. And just think of the fact, and I mean, I certainly couldn't do as good a job as the people do who do the highways and the interstates and things, and they know enough to leave room for it to expand and contract as the temperature changes and all of this, but it just still doesn't seem to work, though. In those days, and of course, maybe we could say, well, we've got such a vast change in climate here in this country, and there in this particular part of the world, it's going to essentially remain warm most of the time. But in those days, they cut big blocks out. And they had wagons that were pulled by teams of oxen that would carry these blocks. And you can even find in certain parts of Italy as well as Greece, certain specific quarries there. And you can see the marks still in the stone of the hammers and the saws, most of the time they sawed their stone blocks, and the teeth, strong teeth of saws, and how they did all that is really a marvel back in those ancient times. To saw those blocks out so precisely, like the building of the pyramids, you know. There's no modern machinery or cranes to lift anything up into place. The building of that is just fabulous. And more fabulous, of course, than these roads. But these roads are, you know, the Roman engineers, it took engineers, by the way. We've talked about occupations before. It would take not just a normal farmer, he wouldn't know what to do, but someone who had studied this and who had practiced this, a Roman engineer, to plan it. You always have to have your road sloping to the both sides, the left and the right. You don't want water to build up in the middle of it. Just a tiny slope is all you need, just a tiny slope. And it'll keep the water going all. You've got to have a good foundation underneath it. That makes all the difference in the world in building a road. You don't just mow the grass down and then lay some tar over the top of that and pour some concrete on that or something and make a road. You dig down and you get gravel and you get a good base there, and then you work up from that, and you end up with your surface, the very top material there. Well, they did all of that with gravel, with a good foundation, and cutting out these stones. Not anything like the pyramids. I mean, some of the pyramid stones can weigh several tons apiece. Just small stones that maybe weigh 50 pounds or something. And lay all those in there piece by piece by piece by piece. Not mortared, cemented together, not like that at all. They just fit so perfectly together. And put that in there, and I think I've even brought a book before and showed you the picture of one of these roads, and the roads are still there today. The Ignatian Way through Thessalonica is still there today. The very same stones. Nothing has changed, except all the corners are kind of rounded and smooth, with people walking on them and rain falling on that over 2 millennia now. Nothing is square anymore. All the stones are kind of rounded on their sides, but the roads are still there. Some of them, if they happen to be in an appropriate place to connect one town or village to another. And Greece is kind of like that. It's a lot like Palestine. You don't have major roads there, very few of those. They'd run between big cities like Athens and Corinth or something. But most of it's just dusty roads, dusty trails. And if you happen to have 2 cities or 2 villages connected by one of these ancient roads, such as the Ignatian Way up in Greece, then even cars will actually travel on the Ignatian Way built by the Romans 2,000 years ago. Public conveniences, I guess you could call that a convenience for the people of that day then. Because like I said, if you've got stones there and the stones are put in place and they're put in place properly, one thing you never have a problem with then is ruts then. You're always going to have the rut problem with just a dirt road. It rains, wagon wheels are pulled over that. They had invented the wheel by those days, remember. Wagon wheels pulled over that. The hooves of horses and donkeys and oxen traveling over that, just going to tear the road to pieces. Well, whenever you've got a stone road, it's not going to do that any damage at all. It's going to be a good traveling road in all weather conditions in. Be a very good traveling road during the winter time or during rain as well, because nothing is going to do any harm or any permanent damage to the road. So I guess we could say that's probably a public convenience for the people of that era. However, the roads, although I'm not meaning to imply they were only 2 in number, they certainly, on this caliber, were not that large in number. Maybe we have a few over in Asia Minor, and that's about all. At least you can see how Rome is connecting itself with all of its southern territory. We discussed earlier in the intertestamental period about Rome's conquest of some of the southern tribes down here, the Etruscans down here. And then the Romans would have to do is get over to this side, the eastern side of Italy, and then sail across. And you'd get to the Ignatian Way, and that'd take you all through the country of Greece. Take you all the way over here into, Constantinople, Byzantium, Istanbul, so you could cross from there, the Dardanelles, over the Straits, the Dardanelles over into Asia Minor. When you get into islands like Melita or Malta and Sicily, and like the southern tip here of Greece, no major roads there. Again, you're back to dusty roads and you're back to dusty traveling conditions. That kind of reminds you then of the pioneers in this country trying to make it out west in the latter part of last century. And if you're traveling in any type of wind at all, think of the dust and the problems you're going to have. And any type of caravan at all would be miserable travel. So these Roman engineered roads were very welcomed as far as the people were concerned as a means of transportation, as a means of traveling. Now, the Romans didn't do that just to satisfy the people. They did it because you could move large segments of the Roman army from one part of the empire to another to guard the frontier, the extents of the Roman Empire. So those are two roads you may want to take note of, the Appian Way and the Ignatian Way. And of course, as I said, they become very important in the spread of the gospel. It's to Paul's advantage, as well as the other apostles and the early Christians, that Rome had come on the scene by this time and had built such roads for the spread of the gospel. Of course, they didn't intend it to be used like that, but God had foreseen it and had overruled in his providence. And remember, we began this study with Galatians 4 there, that the Lord Jesus was born in the fullness of time. And Rome comes on the scene, and certain things that Rome introduces to the world gives us a perfect climate into which the Son of God can be born. And so it makes it that much easier for the apostles, the early missionaries of the church, and the other regular Christians to do a lot of travel if they could connect themselves to one of these roads. Okay, that discusses the availability of roads in Palestine as well as in the empire. That brings us to the subject of conveniences as you're traveling then. We call them Ramadas and Sheridans and Holiday Inns and things like that. Roadside inns. Not exactly like what we have today. Flea-ridden places is really what they were. But they existed. Luke chapter 10 and verse 34 gives us a reference to one. This is in Palestine. Really our only good reference in Scripture. Luke chapter 10 and verse 34. Unless you want to take the rabbinical notion that Rahab was not a harlot but an innkeeper. Then we have an inn back there in Joshua 2, an I-N-N. Now, have you ever noticed this before? Well, surely you have, since we just recently taught on this. Went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Well, they were kind of like a Motel 6 back in those days. That was what quality they were. Fleas everywhere. They were dirty. Many times the owner of the inn, he would rent out a couple of rooms of his house is really what it was. The owner of the inn was an unscrupulous man. He would charge too much. Think what he could get away with on a cold, rainy night. Whenever you go into a city, what do you do? Well, I don't know what you do, but this is what some people do. You stop at Holiday Inn and check their price. If you don't like that, you can walk across the street to Ramada. If you don't like their price, you can walk across the other street and check the Sheraton. And you don't like their price, and so you've only got one corner left, and that's Motel 6. And so you end up staying there. We stayed in a Motel 6 one time. That's probably the last time. You punch air conditioner and it blows out a blast furnace, Everything is always backwards, it seems like. But that was back in the no money days, though. The no money days when it's, like $12. They named it Motel 6 because it used to cost $6 a night. But I think whenever we stayed there, it was all the way up to $12. $12, that's almost giving a room away. A Holiday Inn's going to cost you at least $45 or $50. $12 a night, that's a pretty good price. But see, if you don't like one, you just go to another there. And we're all accustomed. Most Holiday Inns are like other Holiday Inns, and Ramadas are like other Ramadas, and Admiral Benbows are like other Admiral Benbows. But a roadside inn would vary from one thing to the next one, from one to the other. It would vary depending on who the owner was. And it also would vary depending on what time of season you were traveling. And see, what was so scandalous about the whole thing is that most of the time, if you're traveling in good weather, you'll sleep outside. The only time you really have need of an inn is whenever you're traveling in bad weather. So it's kind of like a catch-22 then. If you're only going to go to an inn in bad weather, that's when they're going to have you there, and that's when they're going to raise their prices in, because you won't sleep anywhere else besides right there. So we don't know what type of inn this was. If it was an unscrupulous innkeeper maintaining it, then this Samaritan lost more money than we at first realized whenever we read this story here. because he said, on the morrow when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave them to the host and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever you spend more, when I come again, I'll repay thee. Well, if he was like most innkeepers, he was an unscrupulous innkeeper, and he would have, just jacked the price up. Whenever this man, who in the world is this naive Samaritan coming and writing the man a blank check? That's what we call a blank check. Whatever you spend more than this, I'll repay whenever I come back by. Why, he could charge him $2 million whenever he came back by. Of course, he probably wouldn't pay that much, but the point is they were notorious for being robbers, the people that ran the inns. As I've said, they were too few. There were not a lot of them. They were both too few and too dirty. But on a cold, rainy night, if you could find one, regardless of how dirty it was, you probably would check in. They were flea bags. Fleas were everywhere. Dirty. You could get a little meal there, like a bed and breakfast inn, but your meal wouldn't be too much, and the price would be. All right, while we're still on this subject then, we call that a public convenience. And again, you see how it was a convenience. On a rainy night, it was convenient. But hardly was it a public convenience like we have today. But that's just because we are an age, we are a people of on the move. In the age of transportation, you have to have places to stay whenever you're traveling. What about the method of traveling, the mode of continental transportation? Well, it wasn't a car, train, or airplane. The mode of continental transportation was a beast of burden. If you didn't walk, you generally rode a donkey. Donkeys were the best things for riding because they were cheap. If you had more money, you would purchase a horse. But horses were, for the most part, too expensive. Now, some people would walk. We don't know exactly how the Apostle Paul traveled. Let's put ourselves, before we get beyond the end, let's take it step by step here and put ourselves back into his life and his travels and his position. Do you, in all of Paul's travels, and remember how much he's traveling there in the book of Acts, do you remember Paul ever staying at an inn? There had to be inns around, a few of them anyway. They're too few and too dirty. But we don't have a single recorded occurrence of the Apostle Paul ever staying in an inn. Why is that? That's because he stayed with fellow Christians. And that's what made that such an important aspect of New Testament Christianity, what we refer to as the hospitality of the saints. Let's look at a few verses there before I get any further, and we'll come back to donkeys here. If you go over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. We probably just need to touch on this before going too quickly past all of this. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 10. Speaking about widows here, one that's well reported of for good works. If she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers. She had to be a certain age, 60 years old. But then she had to have other things that would qualify her for being taken into the church's graces. And one of the things mentioned here, if she have lodged strangers. She has washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. And then if you look in Hebrews 13 and verse 2, be not forgetful to entertain strangers. In Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3, one of the qualifications for the bishop was that he was a lover of hospitality. A lover of hospitality. Now, how do you think all of this applied then? Well, it applied to the taking in, especially of fellow Christians, who no doubt were strangers as they were traveling from one place to another. Or the ministers of the gospel, such as the apostles traveling. It would have been a great honor to have an apostle stay in your home. But it would more or less have been not only a great honor, but a spiritual duty of yours to have the apostle in your home. You could either have him in your home or send him down here to the local inn where he would get bitten by fleas down there. And it would mean a lot. And it was a lot to the Christians in the first century. You say, well, how does that apply today? Well, maybe not as, it's not as necessary today, we could certainly say, as it was at one time. But you find remnants of that even today. The lodging of fellow Christians whenever they travel in your area. Sometimes even when you don't know them, you happen to come across them at a certain place and meet them. We've had that happen before. You end up lodging with people that you don't even know just because they're hospitable and they have you into their place then. Well, that's a good mark of true Christianity there, to be willing to do something like that. Have someone in the home and feed someone whenever they come into your home, especially whenever it's a fellow Christian. So no, Paul's not staying in the inns, not that we know of anyway. We don't find that in the book of Acts. Rather, he's staying with other Christians, which you probably already knew and only makes sense. But we're looking at it in light of what we're studying here because of the lack of availability of inns, period, or good inns, we could say, really. And so getting back to the mode of traveling, Paul no doubt sometimes walked, but maybe sometimes he rode a donkey as well. Now, horses were expensive. Think how many times you remember seeing a horse in the New Testament. Not too many times, right? Not until you get over into Revelation and you got the various horses over there. Horses in the New Testament. But donkeys, that's another matter. You could remember some donkeys. Think how many times you remember seeing a horse in the New Testament. Not too many times, right? Not until you get over into Revelation and you got the various horses over there. Horses in the New Testament. But donkeys, that's another matter. You could remember some donkeys. It seemed like Jesus rode into Jerusalem triumphantly there in the last week before his crucifixion on what? A horse? A white stallion? A black beauty? No, he rode in on a donkey, which had been prophesied by Zechariah, which was a sign of his meekness and his humility. A king would come riding in on a king's steed, you see. And Jesus, you say he was a king. Well, he was a king, but he was a different type of king, not a worldly-centered king, not a political king, though. And so he rode just what a king would not ride. And no doubt that's the reason he picked that instead of a horse. He probably could have bought a horse, afforded a horse, or one of his friends, one of the people helping him out in his ministry, could have provided a horse somewhere along the line. But riding in on a horse would have given the wrong image. Riding in on a horse, probably not only would Peter have drawn his sword like he did and cut off Malchus here, but all the apostles would have drawn their sword, and all the disciples around would have drawn their sword, and they would have taken over the city of Jerusalem with much bloodshed or something. No, he had to ride in with a different type of symbol, different type of imagery here. And so he picks a donkey to ride in on. In Luke chapter 2, it's been suggested, and this is probably true, that Mary rode a donkey whenever she had to travel the later stages of her carrying of Jesus in her womb from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. And that probably makes sense. So we've got Luke chapter 2 and Matthew 21, where Jesus rides into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. Remember, horses came in Solomon's time into Palestine from Egypt. As a matter of fact, they really had been forbidden in Deuteronomy 17 by Moses. You think of horses, you think about that. Now you can picture maybe a Ben-Hur or something, and I don't mean a Jewish Ben-Hur, someone up in Rome or Greece or something riding around on horses, but in Palestine, people galloping all around on horses. I mean, you don't even have those images in your mind probably, galloping around on horses. Now if you think of the West in this country, the Apaches or the Cheyenne or something, there you think of horses. But Jews in Palestine galloping around on horses, no, they were plodding around on donkeys is the way they travel. And that's because horses were expensive. Horses were not indigenous. They were an import, and they came from the land of Egypt, if you read the Old Testament in Solomon's time. No doubt there were horses also bred in Israel, but it was nothing that was very important, no. Not widespread because they were too important, too valuable. They cost too much. Okay, then we have another way in which they could travel. If they didn't travel by road, they could travel by water. They could travel by road or they could travel by water. Now, most commercial traveling was done by way of water if the people lived anywhere near the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if you're going from Palestine maybe to India, you might travel by caravan with camels across the deserts and so forth. Camels would be a great source of travel there. But commercial traveling where the peoples or the nations bordered the Mediterranean Sea, commercial traveling would then be done on that sea. Traveling would be done by water. I think the book of Acts would again be our best place to look at this. Paul travels by water on, well, all of the occasions of his journeys, remember. Sooner or later, he's going to be in a boat and he's going to be traveling by water. First, second, third, and fourth journey of Paul, he has something to do with either the Mediterranean Sea or the Aegean Sea. He's traveling. But if we want a specifically commercial reference, we again have to go to the end of the book of Acts, chapter 27. The end of the book of Acts, chapter 27, for a specifically commercial reference to traveling done by water. And here we'll find the case of the traveling commercially by water via the Mediterranean Sea between the countries of Egypt and Italy, or between the cities of Alexandria and Rome. Remember that Paul, first of all, starts off from Caesarea in a ship of Adramyttium. This is Acts 27 and verse 2, named after a seaport up there in Asia Minor. Acts 27:2, Paul starts off from Caesarea in a ship of Adramyttium. However, later in his journey, he transfers ships. And he goes from this ship of Adramyttium to an Alexandrian grain ship that was traveling evidently all the way to Rome. This would be verses 2 through 6, and then we'll jump down to verse 38. All right, we know he's at Caesarea. He's gone through 2 years of trials before Felix and Festus and King Agrippa. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. The next day we touched at Zidon, and Julius courteously, that was the centurion, remember, entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. When we launched from there, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Under would be just the opposite of what we would think of as under. That's just because our map would be reversed to what their map would look like. Let's just give ourselves this much. Give ourselves Palestine over here. They start at Caesarea, then what did it say? You go up here to Sidon, and here's Cyprus right here. It's going to sail under. He said that the winds were contrary. In other words, the winds wouldn't let them go this way. This way would really take them more towards Rome than going up this way. Going to go up here and going to touch down again somewhere along there, I believe. Let's see what he has to say. Verse 5, when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. So that'd be somewhere here, I believe, on the southern coast of Asia Minor. And there the centurion, now look at verse 6 as we compare it with verse 2, entering into a ship of Adramyttium, verse 2, and there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. A ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy. No doubt Adramyttium's up further the coast here. The ship of Adramyttium is just going to go up to Adramyttium. Therefore, the centurion is on the lookout for a ship at one of these ports where they are going to harbor the boat for a while so that he can get his prisoners off of the ship of Adramyttium onto that one that's going all the way to Italy. And he finds one that's going all the way to Italy. Why? You see, we've got Egypt down here. We've got Alexandria right here. Why? Because this whole area of the Nile River mouth, the Nile Delta there, is what we call the breadbasket of the city of Rome. Most of the staples of grain were imported for the Roman people, and they were grown down around Alexandria. We know that from history, but we also know it from Acts 27, because we've got verse 38, which is a proof of that. What was this ship carrying? When they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. They were carrying wheat. tons and tons and tons of wheat loaded on board this ship headed toward Rome. Say, well, why didn't it just sail from, what's it doing up here at this port then? If it left from Alexandria, why not just head in this direction? Well, that's pretty difficult in those days. To take off from here and sail for days, no stops in between before you're going to reach Rome. What they would like to do would be sail like over here, and then sail over here to Greece, and sail around to this side, and then sail around here to Rome. You've got to keep touching base to get water and to get more men on board if your men are tired or something like that. Or to add extra money into the coffers of the ship by picking up passengers and travelers who sometimes would be charged in for their transportation, not commercial transportation, just private transportation, but aboard a commercial ship from one place to another. Therefore, you could make a little extra money if you were the captain of the ship doing that. And of course, you were greatly concerned about the money that you could bring in. So there's transportation for the land and of the Romans and for the world of the Roman Empire and for the world of the New Testament. Transportation by land and transportation by water. All right, then let's just come to another public convenience, and that is the subject of water. Now, we're not talking about travel by water. We're still talking about public conveniences, but a second one here. The large important cities like Rome, Athens, things like this, Alexandria, the large important cities had public drinking fountains. Just amazing what has been discovered archaeologically. Now, how do you think you can make a public drinking fountain? I mean, where you push a button and water shoots out of a little hole and you drink it, and whenever you let go of the button, water goes back in, no more water comes out. We'll just put water high enough above it where water's under pressure, and then have a little release valve there, and I mean have a little marble fountain just like you'd see in Central Park today or something, and push a little catch there and open the little trap door, and water will just come flowing out of that tank right down there to you. People think, well, that was invented back in 1952 or something. No, they've been around for millennia and millennia. Because a very easy principle. You don't have to have underground water main or something to have a drinking fountain. There you've got enough pressure with the underground water main that's going to force the water up. But if you don't have something like that, just put the water above it, and water's going to go down then. Water will seek its lowest level, and it'll be easy to do. Another thing as far as water is concerned, I mean, put yourself in the position of you're out at the city forum. Like whenever we were in Ephesus or Corinth, you'll have this big forum there where all the shops, called the agora there, where all the shops and the marketplace and all of this, and you might live, 5 miles out of town. And you've come into town for the day to do some business or some transaction. Talk to your lawyer about a contract or something. They had lawyers, contracts, all of this back in those days. What are you going to do when you get thirsty? Well, you could lug a thermos along with you, I guess. Or you could just depend on the water fountains around. Again, try to picture all of this in your mind. Don't just listen to words, but picture it in your mind, and you'd have essentially what you have today. You don't carry water with you when you go somewhere. Public buildings have public drinking fountains in them. They had public buildings back in those days. We're going to get to one important type here in a moment. And they had different floors. And they had the stacks and the stairs on the way up, and drinking fountains, tables for public reading where you could sit and browse through the local magazines or the local newspaper or whatever. They had all of that back then. And so if you've got 100 or 200 people stuck in this big building, what are they going to do when they all get thirsty? Well, they're going to go get a drink at the water fountain. Maybe even with Dixie cups. We don't know. Another blessing in the water area, and we can really groan and amen for this, was an underground sewage system. Large cities. If you weren't in a large city, you went out in the brush arbor behind your house. But large cities had underground sewage disposal systems. Now, I hope with all that we've said thus far, you're not really surprised about that, although I guess a lot of people would. Underground sewage disposal system? How in the world? Well, how do we do it today? It's very easy to do. It's very easy to do. Let's construct it in our mind how they would have done it then. And this is not just hypothesis. This is what's been discovered archaeologically. I'm talking about large cities. And I'm talking about public buildings where the mass of the people would be. Not every single home was going to be connected into the main system there, like what we have today in a town or village or metropolitan area. But what about all of the shops that are right in the downtown, the center area where you have so many people there? What happens whenever you get there, you forgot to go to the bathroom before you left home? What are you going to do then? You can't just go behind a shed there or something. Think about these things. You see, we don't think about it. We just think they were somehow primitive or prehistoric back then. But you could have several acre or maybe a square mile area just filled, teeming and bustling with people and shops and all types of things. You're not going to then walk way outside of town to relieve yourself and miss a deal right on the local stock market there. You're not going to dare do that. You're got to stay there, you see. And what if you work in one of these public buildings? You can't be leaving all the time. What if you have sickness in your stomach, you know? You can't, these are things that really happened back then. They happen today. And you're always grateful for a nearby restroom. And there are just millions of them around today, you know. Maybe not as many back then. But in a public area, well, so they certainly had that. If you worked all day at the town clerk's office, you're going to have a bathroom in the town clerk's office then, right? What would you do? What do we think those people did back then? Just held it all day long? Or we just don't ever think about it. We just never think about what happened back then. We just think the 20th century is new and what exists now has never existed before. But things like that have been going on since the garden, remember. You have to relieve yourself. And as you get more people in a large city, then you've got to have a public place in which it can be done. You see, whenever you're at a store, you don't just, I hope you don't, I hope your children don't, sneak behind a clothes rack in Sears or something and relieve yourself. Well, that's what they would have had to do if they wouldn't have built bathrooms, because buildings are everywhere, and you're in there, you just sneak around a corner and relieve yourself. Well, they weren't barbarous people. They were intelligent enough to know that's going to ruin the building and drive our customers away. So we've got to build something. So what are we going to do? We're going to build a public restroom here in this building. One for the men, one for the women, with a little sign that shows a skirt or pants on there, you know. One for the men and one for the women there. And probably it said it on the door. This was for the men and this is for the women. All right, when you go in there, it's probably not one of these marble or these china editions here and these fancy things that they can make today. But there'd be a little thing that you would get up on top of. Do I need to say any more? Yes, I do. Because it's real. It's just real life. They'd get up on top of a little stool, and there would... Well, have you ever been to an outhouse before? You seen what an outhouse looks like? We've got one at our house. We don't ever use it, though. We've got one at our house. If you investigate in our garage, you know that thing that attaches our garage? We got a little workshop to our house, and up underneath the stairs, way back over in the corner. You ever peeked in there before? Never looked in there before. Well, you might wonder if you've never seen one before. What are those two little stools sitting in there for? They got a little top that folds down on top of them there. What are those things? You kind of think you know when you first see them. Well, that looks like a little rest area in there is what it looks like. Well, see, our home was built back in the 1850s, and so was that little rest area right there. You see, our home is not part of a large city. We're connected to a city. See, today you either have a septic tank outside or you're connected to the city. And maybe a few rare people don't have either of those. And that's why you have bushes planted in the back of your yard. You go out behind the bushes. But most of us either have a septic system, which is an underground sewage disposal system. It's the same thing as what the city has, just that yours goes through their pipes, and they have a waste treatment plant somewhere where they have to treat all of that and get rid of all of that. And the bigger the city, the bigger the mess you've got on your hands in. Whenever you got a little small place and you just have a little small, 1,000-gallon septic system out there or something like that. But anyway, maybe you've never seen that. Next time you're over, you should have checked it yesterday whenever you were over there. Hey, that's a good idea. People dirty our house up too much. We're going to make you go there from now on whenever you come over to our house. Well, not really. I might embarrass some of you to ask if I ask, raise your hand if you've ever used one of those before. Probably some of you in here have never even, well, there are some people that have used it. Well, that's most people now. The others we might could call liars because they probably have used it too. Or maybe they're just too modern, I don't know. But what's wrong with it? It's just a big hole dug in the ground. You're really blessed if you can hit a little underground spring there that'll just carry it right on through, and you can channel it on both sides, you know. Because that's what they had back in Rome. What they would do in a public building, you wouldn't just have a huge vat underground, and you've got a million people that live in that city, and 1 million people are going to use that. What they would find would be an underground spring, an underground like a little channel, a small river or something, and dig down to that and be able to dig in both directions, and the water would just continually come through there and wash everything away, you see. Beautiful idea. That's what they had as an underground public sewage disposal system. Maybe not a big fancy treatment factory, you know. If you've ever been to one of those things. Ours in Memphis is at Nonconnah Creek, and it's a Nonconnah treatment facility there, and it just reeks the atmosphere if you get anywhere near there. And the interstates crisscross all around there, you know, and just whenever you drive by there, you know you're in a sewage area. And Nonconnah Creek is a sewage creek as well, so you don't ever swim in that. But that makes a lot of sense for the necessity of something like that in ancient times. Most outhouses are not connected to any water system. It's just a hole dug in the ground. And hopefully like only one family would make use of that. And just over the process of time, what happens? It just decays and rots and returns to dust scent. No problem at all. When you get a lot of people out there, then's when you're going to have your problem. Then's when you have to have something a little more sophisticated, like they'd have in a city at Rome or Corinth or something like that. I mean, I don't mean to be crude. I think I'm just telling you the real facts of life here. And your parents, your grandparents, that's what they used all the time. They were brought up on that. And you think of the convenience you have now on a cold January morning, and all 4 of your children need to go at the same time, and you need to go. You know, we always look for these houses where it says 4 bedrooms and 2.7 baths, you know, where you got enough of them spread around the house. 2.5 baths, that always sounds good, 2.5 baths, because you know what 2 baths are, you know what that half bath is also. 2.5 baths there, especially if you've got 10 people in the family. If you've got an outhouse that's 100 feet away from the back door of your house and it's 20 below zero outside, and you've got a stomach ache, you're going to spend a half hour out there in that temperature? Well, that happened. You just would stay out there until you were through with your business. And if it was a half hour, it was just a half hour then. Think you'd have to dress, gloves, mittens, ski caps to go to the restroom. What a convenience it is today to have indoor plumbing today. Indoor plumbing. But they had in those days in the public arena indoor plumbing. Indoor plumbing for drinking fountains, for the disposal of sewage as well. Well, let's go on to another blessing about water. They had many blessings about water. So you see you can relieve yourself in 2 different ways there. The 2 different things we've discussed, and another way you can relieve yourself was by means of the public baths. And some of these were very elaborate. We have some interesting, funny references to these in church history. But public baths, where you'd have, and many times, especially in a place like Rome, they're made out of marble. You'd have something that what we would call today a swimming pool. It was not a little bath, 3 feet by 5 feet or something. It was Olympic-sized swimming pool is what it was. But it was a public bath. They had one for the men, they had one for the women in a certain area. Now, they had these, dear friends, back 100 years ago out west in this country. You go into town, there was a public bath there. One for the men, one for the women. A public place where all of this took place. Well, they had them then. And essentially, here's what would take place. It was enclosed. Not necessarily the roof was. Sometimes the roof was, but it had to have, barriers around it. The men would go in, strip their clothes off, And we're not even going to get into a lot of other things we could. They had saunas back then, built-in rooms that were saunas, and they were right next to the bath and all of this, but we're just talking about water right now. Let's say the men, for instance, would go in, strip down to the nude, take their clothes off. They would have dishes of soap around the side of the bath. It was run by the city, so it would sometimes cost a fee. They'd have a little meter there, a little collection box. You'd drop your drachma in, your shekel if you were from Palestine, or your denarius. You'd drop that in and hop in and take a bath. Quite a convenience for those days. The women likewise would have their public bath, and one was for the women, one for the men. Now, I tell you, I said before that we have interesting stories in church history. We have stories such as one about the Apostle John. You probably heard it before, but concerning one of the early heretics of the church, John was going into one of the public baths in Ephesus one day. We're not for sure how certain this is, but it sounds like John. Whenever he ends his first epistle, he said, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." Well, whenever he was going into a public bath one day, someone alerted him at the door that a certain notable heretic of the church was in there at the public bath. And I mean, it was like a swimming pool where you'd have maybe 20 men in there at the same time bathing themselves. Whenever John found out there was a heretic in there, he said, "I won't get in the water with that heretic then." He said, "I won't even taint myself being in the same public bath as that heretic." Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that's a common story in church history, and it seems like that has happened more than once in the early stages of church history. Now, something else I wanted to mention here, just kind of to tie it in sociologically with where we are today. I don't know if you know enough, sociologically speaking, about things to realize that today you almost have to find older men. I know with the introduction of the gay scene and all of this, you're a little hesitant to do anything around other men, but you almost have to find older men to really find people who, how can I put it? Well, let's say it like this. It would be rare to find anyone even wanting to use a public bath today, men, because of having to be in the nude with other men around. You know what I'm talking about there? You almost have to find older men who are not embarrassed to have their clothes off in front of another man. I found that to be true, the people that I've been around. You almost have to find someone older, someone more mature, not to be embarrassed to have his clothes off in front of another man. That's why they built these little stalls with the stools and the doors on them. You know, sometimes they don't have doors on them at all. And some people won't even go in there and use them. It's too embarrassing, they think. Just too embarrassing to go in and use it because it doesn't have a door. Maybe someone's going to come by and see me or something. Well, horror of horrors. You were nude when you came out of your mother's womb. And you'll be nude in the earth one day, too. So it's not the worst thing that could happen in the world. Of course, we're keeping the sexes distinguished from one another, of course. We're not talking about a unisex bathroom or something. Scriptures, as well as ourselves, would be totally frowning on that. But I don't know. It's just something came to my mind. It's interesting. I don't know that public baths in the wholesale sense as this. I recognize they still have them in big cities in this country today. But I don't know if they would go over so well, because we've become a very private society, a very private group of people, where some women are embarrassed, like to have their shirt off in front of another woman. They're embarrassed to, like there's something unclean or dirty about it. And I realize, like I say, with the gay society around us, you're a little hesitant to be in the nude around someone else. But if you've ever, I'm just thinking like whenever I went to Israel, I happened to stay with a more mature man, and I was conscious of the fact, if you're not with someone more mature, they won't even undress in front of you. They'll sneak in the bathroom and undress and slip on their robe and slip out into the bedroom, and whenever it's time to go to sleep, they turn the lights off before they take their robe off. Afraid to be seen in their undergarments. I'm just talking not about in the nude, but undergarments. Afraid to be seen in their undergarments by another figure of the same sex. Well, I guess my point is, in those days, they didn't really think like that. We have become such a private society. We hate to have our clothes off in front of even members of the same sex, and in that day it was a different situation. Okay, another thing about water, they had showers also. Not just a large swimming pool-sized public bath, but they had showers. As a matter of fact, the shower was invented by the Greeks. And again, it doesn't take but a little bit of your imagination, and you can figure out how you make a shower. You've ever seen anyone set a bucket on top of the door, so whenever you open it, it triggers the bucket to fall with water on your head? You know how they'd make a shower then. Just get the water up high enough. And have a little tube that has many little holes in it if you really want that shower feeling instead of one stream of water out of there. And have a little cap on it that you turn just slightly and it'd block all the holes up. Turn it a little bit, it'd open the holes, and water would come out. And you'd have like a little attendant there who would stand and would fill the pail or whatever on top, back up with water again after you had lathered up and rinsed a little bit whenever you wanted to rinse a little bit more. So they had all of this in public areas. Now, most homes wouldn't have something like this. It'd be the super rich in Rome or something like that, the senators, the Caesars, that would maybe actually have a home with baths and showers and saunas and things like this already in it. And let's then move on quickly before we run out of time to libraries, another public convenience that they had. This gives us one example of public buildings. And I guess the most notable of the ancient world was the Library of Alexandria, a very famous library indeed. And that library had 500,000 volumes in it. Many stories high, many stacks, many shelves, 500,000 volumes. Now, the codex had not been invented by this time, so we're talking about scrolls slipped into little pigeonhole compartments, 500,000 of them representing various books, manuscripts representing various written works. And it was a public library. They had a checkout counter with a clerk where you would check out a scroll. They would let you check it out for X number of days, and if you didn't return it on time, they would fine you. I think that's what they do today. Same thing. Many things about humanity have simply not changed.